So the title of the talk today is Religious Pluralism, Essential or Challenge to Liberal Democracy. And I want to start by just giving a little bit of an outline to where I think some of the conversations are in the Western world, but largely in Europe. The Western world is, we talk in generalizations, but I'm talking largely in Europe, in terms of the state's relationship to religion, how the state thinks of religion. And then I want to talk a little bit about how Islamic law is creating a new momentum of that particular relationship in terms of what is the state's reach when it comes to personal faith, and how far should the state intervene or create the distinction between public and private when it comes to issues of personal faith. While religious pluralism is often regarded as a positive, indeed defining aspect of Western democracies, the mix of different religious and cultural identities has raised some unique challenges for secular liberal states. It's required us to rethink the limits of pluralism and individualism for what sociologists and policymakers call cultural cohesion. Or as one major newspaper editor said to me some years ago, it's difficult to integrate with Muslims because you never meet them in the pub. Sometimes integration is simply a matter of who you drink with. In recent years, in much of Western Europe, there has been at times a critical reaction to what some see as exceptionalism for those of particular religious faith, especially but not exclusively for sections of the Muslim community. This tension has led to a rethinking of the state's relationship to religion, often presented in popular parlance as political and social divisions, which in itself has been exacerbated by the recent challenges and fears around migration resulting from the conflicts in the Middle East. But underneath all of this is the existential question of what Europe herself stands for as a cultural project and as a unifying polity. In Western Europe today, despite, for example, the Catholic Church being a dominant religious presence in France, the Church of England, the established church in the UK, when we speak of societal norms and laws, the default position for most is that we live in secular democracies, and not just democracies, but places where liberalism prevails. Now, there are a whole load of definitions of what liberalism means, but I'm going to take just one definition. In his definition of the modern democratic state being liberal, Craig Hovey defines liberalism through the exploration of Rawlsian concepts of maximum justice and maximum opportunity for all people. He writes, "Liberalism is a political philosophy that seeks societal stability and unity in the absence of shared conceptions of the common good. It's therefore regularly associated with contemporary discussions of religious and other pluralisms, and especially in our day is connected to the anxieties that set in when moral convictions previously thought to be self-evidently true and binding lose their obviousness. How then will a society composed of diverse individuals, people of various faiths and traditions, function for its betterment?" So liberalism conceives of humans as individuals who enjoy relative freedom to organize their common lives. Beyond the definition and limits of the nation state, law and governance, liberalism value lies in relating concepts of human dignity to happiness and human empowerment, integral to human flourishing. This view has captured our imagination and immersed itself in the global political and legal discourse. But among the many critiques of political liberalism is a recurrent issue that liberalism lacks depth, advancing concepts of the individual over the human person, positing the doctrine of the unencumbered self, that the individual must remain free and untrammeled, whose autonomy is their supreme and ultimate right. My colleague, the theologian David Ferguson, echoes a tension faced in freedom and rootedness in some form of religious worldview. He writes, "It presents the individual as already valuing its autonomy prior to any other substantive moral commitment. In doing so, it denudes the self of the necessary resources for moral reasoning and decision-making. The individual of political liberalism is thus deracinated. She or he is no longer situated in a community or tradition of moral inquiry in terms of which judgments can be understood and practiced. The shared goods and ends of human life are no longer built into the liberal individual's initial moral situation. These can be selected and endorsed by an act of freedom. Theological critics of liberalism, though, not necessarily democracy, note that descriptions of what constitutes a people, such as baptism, will often conflict with political descriptions, such as nation-state citizenship. A particular example was given in the 2nd century epistle to Diognetus. Again, this is an example from Chris Hovey. Christians dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as if foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. The argument is that if Christians confess a heavenly citizenship, their attachments and loyalties to political, ethnic, and other groups becomes less important. That is, eschatologically, they are provisional and withering away. But Christianity is defined incorrectly, often by minimizing the political elements. As Christopher Rowland has argued, the roots of this dualism lie in the Bible, not least in eschatology. That which is perfect is still to come, 1 Corinthians, when the new Jerusalem comes down from heaven on earth. Of course, you have the messianic and community cohesion, the life of the community, waiting for the consummation of the messianic times, a constant dialectic in the letters of Paul. Of course, community cohesion means something quite different here. And of course, then you also have the ongoing discussion on temporal and spiritual authority reflected in Luther's two governments, two kingdoms doctrine. And then we have the post-liberal theology, which represents itself as an alternative to the entire program of and influences of liberalism, even as it presents itself as rather confessional and fideistic. Its purpose is to safeguard the distinctiveness of the Christian tradition, but this is nothing new. Between Christ and Caliph, in his recent work Between Christ and Caliph, Levi-White examines the multi-confessional society of early Islam through the lens of shifting marital practices of Syriac communities, Christian communities. Despite the growth of Islamic law and governance from the 7th century onwards, Syriac Christian bishops created new laws to regulate marriage, inheritance, and family life. The bishops banned polygamy, required that Christian marriages be blessed by priests, and restricted marriage between cousins, seeking ultimately to distinguish Christian social patterns from those of Muslims and Jews. Their desire was to be a community apart, while still maintaining a place in the Islamic social order. Household life was tied to religious, and this interreligiosity lay at the heart of the medieval Islamic empire. And similarly, Quranic and early writings on the merging community of believers speaks of how social solidarity is built amongst those belonging to the new faith. A consistent theme of the Quran is that those who become friends and protectors of each other are active members of the community. Those who believe emigrate and strive with their wealth and their body in the way of God. Those who give shelter and help, they are the ones who are friends of one another. The believer is commanded not to seek friendship or take as advisors those who are non-Muslims, as they will only have hostility towards Islam. In the Quran, friendship and social ties are envisaged largely within the theme of forging alliances. And these alliances can be on the human plane between individuals, politically between communities, or between human beings and God. Whereas before there were tribal, kinship, and blood loyalties, now religion had taken over. Pushed further, as Andrew March has shown in his recent book, The Caliphate of Man, prominent theories of political Islam advanced another principle, the Quranic notion that God's authority on earth rests not with the sultans and the viziers or the scholars who had interpreted the written law, but with the entirety of the whole Muslim people, the Ummah, the Caliphate of Man. While God is sovereign, he has appointed the multitude of believers as his vicegerents, as his representatives. The Caliphate of Man argues that the doctrine of the universal human caliphate underpins a specific democratic theory, a kind of Islamic republic of virtue in which the people have authority over the government and religious leaders. Islamic thought is contrary to popular perceptions, replete with multiple ways of thinking about the divine human covenant. Borders and nation states, though, may seem antithetical to thinking of the church as God's family, and a microcosm of the world, and the Ummah as a body of people who transcend the pre-Islamic ties of blood and tribe. But we live in the age of the nation-state, and in a world divided either by whichever way you go west, or Huntington's phrase, the West and the rest. Here, how we speak of citizenship, sovereignty, and the public square continues to create a particular challenge. In his book, The Stillborn God, Mark Leela remains amazed of the continuing appeal of religion and its successors. We are disturbed and confused, he writes. We find it incomprehensible that theological ideas still inflame the minds of men, stirring up messianic passions that leave societies in ruin. We assumed this was no longer possible, that human beings had learnt to separate religious questions from political ones, that fanaticism was dead. We were obviously wrong. This has been echoed in recent years in the new atheism debates, which accuse religion as a failed science. For the new atheists, all major religions are bad, but Islam is seen by some as uniquely dangerous to civilization, or as Sam Harris says in The End of Faith, Islam has the makings of a cult of death. For Leela, however, whatever other civilizations may choose, we in the West have already chosen. We have chosen to keep our politics unilluminated by the light of revelation. He makes huge assumptions about the collective we and us, but argues that we have chosen against political theology. And there are echoes of Carl Schmitt that political theology was never rejected by the West, rather it migrated from the church to the state. Today the state may be sovereign above all other institutions, but it also bears a moral commitment towards its citizens, especially its minorities. And this can mean that despite a person's own faith practices or values, their own religious affiliations, it is the state which to some extent decides the religious from the non-religious, the public from the private, and the communal from the personal. Religious voices may have influence, but they yield little structural power. The state, for its part, is concerned with the defense of the right and not just the good, according to John Rawls's definition. Political concepts are based on plurality, equality under the law, diversity, and mutual limitations. And as Hannah Arendt writes, and I think it's probably one of the best quotes, a citizen is by definition a citizen among citizens of a country among countries. His rights and duties must be defined and limited, not only by those of his fellow citizens, but also by the boundaries of a territory. Philosophy may conceive of the earth as a homeland of mankind and of one unwritten law, eternal and valid for all. But politics deals with men, nationals of many countries and heirs to many pasts. Its laws are the positively established fences which hedge in, protect, and limit the space in which freedom is not a concept, but a living political reality. When it comes to Western Europe, we need to add the perceived challenges of the state's relationship to religious communities, rather than a religion as a defined category of doctrines and practices, and increasingly the law's relationship to religious exceptionalism. And this is against a Europe which, as I said earlier, going through its own soul-searching. If Europe's past was Christian, what about Europe's future? What holds Europe together apart from the economic ties? Cultural values. It was Giorgio Agamben who in 2013 revived the idea of a union of southern European countries, a proposal first launched by another philosopher, Alexandra Kojev, just after World War II, who proposed that the Latin Empire could act as a counterweight to the dominant role played by Germany in the European Union. Of course, we're still seeing that with Brexit at the moment. Europe pays homage to the spiritual heritage of religion, and while it mentions the role of churches, like the draft constitution of 2004, the Lisbon Reform Treaty, does not specify which spiritual or religious heritage is inspirational. Article 22 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights provides that the Union, that is the European Union, must respect religious diversity. This expresses the neutrality of the Union towards different religions and is consistent with both the foundational instruments of the community and the practice of function regulatory instruments. They expressly recognize the trajectory of religious diversity, the need to work with religious pluralism, and the growth of interaction between religion in Europe and beyond. Consequently, the value of religion, of their diversity, plurality, is known to the EU legal order, and value systems of different religions or ethnic minority groups lay foundation for positive attitudes. Indeed, non-discrimination is a fundamental principle of the European Union. But the recent flow of refugees and migrants from the Middle East and North Africa has reignited the civilizational debate about culture, religion, and Europe's Christian heritage. The speeches which resonate in many parts of Europe invoke a nostalgia for how Europe is remembered, but they are seen by many as best hearkening to an ideal rather than a reality of the past, so divisive, even destructive to the peaceful continuity of the European project. For some, the most urgent reason why action on immigration is required lies precisely in the rise of nationalist and what is now seen spoken of very frequently as populist, but I'm not sure I like that word, anti-immigrant, anti-EU parties. Many politicians and activists have a deep desire to curb the effects of political rhetoric, verging onto right-wing nationalisms, which see the influx of refugees and uncontrolled borders as quite simply a threat to European civilization. In her closing speech of the two-day Front National Party conference in 2017, Marine Le Pen proclaimed that we are at a crossroads. This election is a choice of civilization in the face of massive migration. The structural dominance of sovereign states and national priorities have resulted in various kinds of backlash against migrant flows, often at the expense of humane or visionary solution. Words such as traveller, migrant, refugee, and displaced persons are often used interchangeably, but they mean different things legally and politically. They have become intrinsic to the contested moral discourse around human dignity versus monetary resources, challenging convictions about identity, race, social cohesion, and belonging. It's also led to disputed concepts of good religion, good migrant, bad migrant, where religion, namely Islam, is seen to have contributed to the contemporary political and social unsettling of Europe and the West. But despite its commitment to pluralism and diversity, the EU needs to wrestle with her own internal contradictions. In a recent article in The Guardian, "Why is Brussels so white?", Sarah Chanda argues that just having people of colour in office cannot guarantee racial progress. Representation is only one step along the way. If the EU institutions and parties fail to represent citizens of colour, they'll prove to be not so different from the racists and nationalists who are simply more explicit in their belief that Europe is white. The EU's lack of racial diversity is in itself a crisis of legitimacy. The EU needs to reimagine itself. Migrants, minorities, and people of colour are undeniable fact of Europe's contemporary reality, and it's time that Europe reflected that. The terrorist attacks in recent years have fueled several debates, including the return to familiar historical tropes of pitting Christianity, and of course it's only white Christianity, against non-white Islam, essentializing Islam as the archaic and often unwelcome other of a benign Christian Anglo-Saxon Europe. Islam's beliefs and practices are too visible and awkward. It doesn't quite fit in with the demands and attractions of modern Western life. Some see Islam as the only remaining alternative to Western civilizational hegemony and homogeneity. The Bulgarian scholar, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, but Theophanov argues that notwithstanding differences, Western European societies are deeply secular societies, but which respect religious freedom. The privatization of religion here is a character of a modern secular society. And he writes, these societies have a much greater difficulty in recognizing some legitimate role for religion in public life and in the organization and mobilization of collective group identities. Muslim organized collective identities and their public representations become a source of anxiety, not only because of their religious otherness as a non-Christian and non-European religion, but more importantly, because their religiousness itself is the other of European secularity. For others, anti-Muslim sentiment is both a racial and religious issue. Both have become almost taboo subjects, yet they are hidden within the ultimate debate in the West, which for me is about values. Values have become the major criterion by which we discussed contemporary ethics in liberal democracies and politics. As Anne Norton has recently written in her book on the Muslim question, that while once there was a Jewish question, today the figure of the Muslim has become the axis where questions of political philosophy and political theology, politics and ethics meet. Islam is marked as a preeminent danger to politics, to Christians, Jews and secular humanists, to women, sex and sexuality, to the values and institutions of the Enlightenment. Conversely, for many Christians who hope for a return of Christendom, only a Christian Europe can accommodate and welcome Islam. Some of you may have read John Milbank's tweet last year. Yes, I read tweets, about the singer Sinead O'Connor's conversion to Islam. Whatever you think of either Milbank or Sinead O'Connor, he refers to Michel Houellebecq, dubbed the enfant terrible of French literature, whose recent novel Soumission, or Submission, set in France 2022, where a moderate Islamic party sweeps to power, backed by all the mainstream parties keen to keep Le Pen out. So this is Houellebecq's novel. When asked what he was afraid of, he replies that it all goes wrong in the West. You could say that it's already going wrong. The interviewer asks him, does he mean terrorism? He nods. Yes, and some say that it's only a tiny percentage of people, but maybe very few people can have a very strong effect. It's often the most resolute minorities that make history. Milbank argues that Houellebecq has it right. Liberals will embrace an authoritarianism to escape their own contradictions if it's respectably other and non-Western. That Sinead O'Connor is a civilizational traitress and has no taste. To some extent, increasingly, our public debate about religion is increasingly being polarized as a theology of civilizational choices. Liberal democracy is underpinned by a commitment to religious pluralism as a social good, but not necessarily as a moral worth. For the state has another concern, constitutional commitment to equality for all. An imbalance about this plays into the hands of the populist, because populism is wedded to neither constitutionalism nor liberalism. It rides on the broken promise of democracy, that our social and political framework always favors one group over another, that ordinary working people are being left behind by the privileged elite. This is the call of Brexit. This is its biggest appeal and a testament to a certain failure in politicians who have failed to appreciate growing social unrest and frustration. Jan Muller says in his book on populism, populism is neither the authentic part of modern democratic politics, nor a kind of pathology caused by irrational citizens. It is the permanent shadow of representative politics. There's always someone who claims to speak for the concerns of real people, and Islam is a concern which easily absorbs or hides so many other social ills. Many different faiths in Western Europe, but Islam currently, I think, is still the most contentious. And so I'm just going to give a couple of examples. And the first one is about France and laïcité. And I'm sure all of you know everything about laïcité in France, but I want to give this example as something that people in the UK find fascinating because we think that we have the answers to pluralism. But actually, I think there is something in what laïcité is trying to achieve here. And the example is of the face veil. What is acceptable clothing in Western terms assumed an interesting twist in the 2010 Guérin report, when it was claimed that the French ban on the full face veil did not go against the freedom of dress, because Western civilization had no such things as clothes for the face. The Guérin report emphasized the French Republican values of equality, liberty, and fraternity, and had as one of its central arguments that the face veil eliminates the possibility for individual expression, that the West and the whole trajectory of the West, its art, its literature, is based on the gaze and the face, thus disabling its wearer from being an equal in society. On this point, the members of the Commission were clear. The face veil denies all individuality and thus all dignity to the one who wears it, whether she does so voluntarily or not, but the equal dignity of all human beings is a philosophical, even anthropological foundation of the principle of equality in the Republic. The discussions unveiling in Europe are now immersed in complex ideals of freedom, femininity, and faith. But they are also about the shared public space. The philosopher Blandine Kriegel, who worked for President Chirac, argued for the social contract. We believe in laïcité because we have to place ourselves in the public space. And the way we do that is that we abstract from our individual characteristics, from where we came, our roots. This is the idea of the social contract. Thus, what she's implying is that although people can come with different backgrounds, different nationalities and histories, the movement should be from pluralism to unity through consent. The public space should be neutral with respect to religion. Most recently, the Flanders region of Belgium has banned halal and kosher slaughter because of animal rights campaigns. Some have claimed that the ban amounts to nothing more than anti-Semitism and anti-Islamic feeling. But animal rights campaigners have long asserted that the Jewish kosher and Muslim halal rituals are inhumane. Which minority will win out? Because lawmaking is also about making choices and deciding on preferred values. The legal cases which reflect the tension between public morality and seemingly religious exceptionalism show that in the case of the UK, a nation's moral consciousness is far less grounded in religion and authority than it was only a generation ago. And I want to give one example which you may have heard of, Ash's Bakery, which came to the headlines as the gay cake. I think you have your own gay cake, but this was about Ash's Bakery, and I just want to go through this because it took a while, this case. The owners of a bakery, so Ash's Bakery was owned by a Christian couple who refused to make a cake supporting gay marriage. So their client came to them and said, we want you to make the cake and we want you to put the slogan on it to support gay marriage. The Christian couple, Daniel and Amy MacArthur, who ran the Belfast Ash's Baking Company, told the client, Gareth Lee, that they would not make the cake featuring Sesame Street puppets and the logo of campaigning group Queerspace. After a long-running legal battle over whether the MacArthurs broke discrimination laws, 5 Supreme Court judges announced their decision weeks later. Delivering the ruling, Supreme Court President Lady Hale, this is the same Lady Hale who recently said that Boris Johnson should not have prorogued Parliament and that it was null and void, said the couple did not refuse to make the cake because of Mr. Lee's sexual orientation. She said their objection was to the message on the cake, not to the personal characteristics of Mr. Lee or anyone else with whom he was associated. So bakers basically won the case. The bakers could not refuse to supply their goods to Mr. Lee because he was a gay man or supported gay marriage, but that is quite different from obliging them to supply a cake iced with a message with which they profoundly disagreed. Lady Hale said the ruling was not in any way to diminish the need to protect gay people and people who support gay marriage from discrimination, but she said it is deeply humiliating and an affront. Gareth Lee said, it is deeply humiliating and an affront to human dignity to deny someone a service because of that person's race, gender, disability, and sexual orientation. Mr. Lee said that he was made to feel like a second-class citizen by Ash's refusal to make the case he requested. The judgment tells me that it's okay, he said. I'm concerned not just with the implications for myself or other gay people, but for every single one of us. Do we have to guess when we go into a shop whether we're going to be served or not? Speaking outside the court, Mr. MacArthur said, this is the bakers, that the ruling protected freedom of speech and freedom of conscience for everyone, and insisted that Mr. Lee was welcome to return to their bakery. We're particularly pleased the Supreme Court emphatically accepted what we've said all along. We did not turn down this order because of the person who made it, but because of the message itself. And this is, the reason I brought this case up was because this is just one recent example of how many Christians see their voices as the minority in multicultural societies. They see their voices as a minority in democratic but increasingly secularized societies, because in an age of equality, liberalism can only tolerate liberalism. It struggles with personal conscience on various matters of private and public interests. But populism uses Christianity as a plea against the spread of Islam and the call for Europe's true heritage. It is liberal values of a free expression which underpin religious pluralism and for minority rights to worship. But minority religions, and especially Islam, are regarded as one of the main causes of social instability and political anger. Ironically, the influence of a certain type of Christian evangelical base is also a problem for secular societies, even if often they both share a common stance against Islam. For most Western Europeans, the word which evokes anti-liberalism the most is the word Sharia, because most Europeans see Sharia as the ultimate challenge to liberal values rather than intrinsic to religious observance. And here I should add the problem with starting any conversation on Sharia is exactly where do you start? Misleadingly but commonly translated as Islamic law, the term has come to mean synonymously with penal law, stripped of its broader ethical dimension and the fluidity of juristic reasoning. As Western Muslims, we have to think of Sharia today not only as a historical enterprise of the Muslim world, but also against a culturally Christian Europe. In public, but also Western scholarly debates, Sharia tends to be locked into important, but often poorly thought through, if not downright contemptuous discussions on criminal law and female agency. It goes down the positive law route, coded and defined as the West understands law. But the reality is that a word which for centuries belonged to the colonial other, considered low, even dead tradition, is now a living, observed reality in Europe. For many, it represents an audacity, a hostility, or apathy to everything the Enlightenment project has struggled against. Envied by some, despised by others, it represents a faith without boundaries. In popular discourse, Sharia is an all-encompassing term which is more akin to worship and custom than law, and thus more susceptible to a variety of practices. The non-Muslim needs to be told that fasting and prayer, ritual practices such as halal slaughter, but also observance of aspects of personal law, that is marriage and divorce, are all Sharia. Aspects of Sharia are already in place here, and where some are accepted, that is in the West, even encouraged, such as finance packages, others are condemned for disregarding individual human dignity. The phrase, "What does Sharia say?" is probably one of the most popular but misleading questions, because it shows how superficially Sharia is perceived, because it falls between the cracks of law and religion. Made harder to understand because hardly anyone speaks of the relevance of biblical law in Christian Europe as a lived reality. Of course, there are so much bigotry behind Sharia as well, and I just want to give one example. Two examples. One is of the recent grooming gangs. So the grooming gangs in certain parts of northern cities in the UK, gangs of South Asian men largely who were grooming young girls. And this had been going on for years, and it's taken the police years to not only charge and convict them, but actually prior to that, for the police to even believe that the girls were telling the truth. All matters, private and public, collapse within a seamless anti-Muslim narrative when something like this happens. The worst successes of cultural crimes collapse under the reductive phrase Muslim communities. The crime of grooming becomes a racial crime of grooming, festering within secretive Muslim neighborhoods. This is fertile territory not only for populism, but far-right voices who want revenge on what they see as innocent white culture. It feeds off angry or bored young men, and such men are in abundance, not just in minority communities, but largely in Western Europe. Western Europe has become an ideological battleground between different shades of angry young men, the Islamists and the far-right movements. And recently, there are protests going outside a Birmingham school, I don't know whether any of you have heard of this, where parents are protesting. There are parents of all backgrounds, but largely Muslim parents. Unfortunately, most of these parents who are protesting don't even have children at the school, but they're still protesting, that in 2020, the UK government is going to bring a certain type of it's not sex education teaching, it's family teaching, where young children will be able to see books where all kinds of parents will be in these books, same-sex couples, 2 women, 2 men. So they want to show these young people that it's okay, families now come in different shapes, different sizes, different backgrounds. And these parents are protesting, and they are saying that the state should not intervene in how we want to raise our children morally. Of course, they will fail. This law will pass, and this will become an active rule in all primary schools. But again, behind the Muslim anger are also some Christian and Jewish families that are also very much against how far will the state go in terms of intervening in how parents want to raise their children morally or what values they want to give them. But again, personally speaking, I think that the state has a duty to equality, and this is what the state is struggling with at the moment. Public discourse on religions maintains a cautious approach to the power of theological language, which in the age of the internet and globalization can travel thousands of miles in seconds. What happens in the caves of Yemen, the neighborhoods of Mosul, the trendy malls of Dubai, the streets of Cairo, has consequences almost immediately on the boulevards of Paris and the streets of London. Time and space collapse as the distance between cultures, language, and ideologies is bridged through the power of technology. This process of technological globalization has immediate local impact in multicultural societies. For Chiara Buttigieg, this resurrection of the public role of religion has been the result of the reduction of politics and the imagination. And I will conclude very soon. She writes, "The current resurrection of religion in the public sphere is linked to a deep transformation of political imagination, which has its roots in the double process of the reduction of politics to mere administration, on the one hand, and to spectacle on the other. In an epoch where politics is said to be simply a question of good governance, of good administration, with a neoliberal consensus, the paradox is that of a lack of political imagination, which goes hand in hand with its amplification through the media." So why is pluralism worth preserving? Today, the modern nation state has the power to penetrate all layers of society in a way simply incomparable with anything in the pre-modern period. But liberal democracies and the nation state have not really been able to flatten the public space, and religious groups have always relied or created exceptionalism to define themselves from majority rule. Pluralist societies flourish because of people's commitment to civic engagement, not their indifference. Even in an age of fear and uncertainty, as exemplified in Zygmunt Bauman's writings on liquid modernity, where he presents a narrative of endemic uncertainty, the collapse of traditional frames of reference, and the deepening of personal and social anxieties. Ranging from personal relationships to societal bonds, his work defines modernity as a struggle on all fronts. The metaphor of liquidity effectively defines the essence of the world we live in, where social and political stability of the past is partly being nullified because of the very progress of knowledge and technological process that modernity itself had endorsed. A nation was once about territory, culture, and language, but in the age of Facebook, a nation seems to be an ensemble of mobile individuals. And the question of how engaged you are with the debates and problems of your country depend, he says, on whether you are online or offline. Liberal democracies don't require perfect equality, but they do thrive on people of different backgrounds and beliefs being able to live together at some level. They also rely on everyone to feel that for all their material as well as cultural differences, they have a stake in the moral life and well-being of the country they call home. The question is, what makes a people other than having political rights to govern themselves? We can all coexist to an extent in a physical space, but we do often as inhabitants rather than as a society. Coexisting in a neighborhood seldom makes us a community. Today, there seem to be no more meta-narratives about how to lead the good life. Indeed, the philosophical concern appears to focus more on how to derive meaning in a life where meaning itself is contested. In an age of sound bites, hashtags, and now fake news, we need to stretch a sympathetic imagination to meet so many challenges of our time. And these challenges, however polarizing, will not be resolved by harsh words and clashes, which are increasingly informing the politics of our time. Our politics reflects our ethics. The democratic impulses are strong, but today politics and the challenges of pluralism go hand in hand. Politics is not simply about candidates and voting, but rather about a desired vision for your society, where peace and justice and community are all fragile, may be undesired by some, but must be based on some semblance of justice and not supremacy. There is no room for complacency, but neither, it seems to me, is there any alternative to coexistence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we were all fascinated by a view into the European world from this side of the pond, as we sometimes say. The floor is now open to questions, since some of those same issues are on this side of the pond. I would ask, we've got a microphone, would you identify yourself and make sure that you pose your question succinctly? Up here and then back there.
Hi, my name is Spencer. Thank you for your wonderful lecture. You spoke about the tension between the family and the state. And in the Christian world, the family has been given a lot of primacy in terms of the basic foundational unit of a society. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the relationship between the family and the state in Islam, and how that relates to the secular versus religious state.
I think the family is, on the one hand, if we just look at the Quran itself, but no religion is just based on scripture, we know that. But if we just look at the Quran itself, there is assumption that people will have family. An assumption is made. So on the one hand, there is no command that you must marry and multiply, but there is an assumption just in the verses that there will be children and there will be husband and wife. Muslim jurists and Muslim thinkers and Muslim societies generally hold the family as probably the key to what makes a community, let me put it that way. But I suppose the issue is that what we are now seeing is a fragmentation. I think there is a slight difference between what you're saying and asking about there is no ecclesiology here, let me put it that way, okay? If that's behind your question, there is no that the family is in some way a reflection of a transcendent concept. But I do think that so much of what the good life is about is contained within the relationships within family. And that's not all good stuff. That is all stuff about patience, about mutual respect, about knowing boundaries. I think the question for me, though, is not so much the family vis-a-vis the state, but what the family means today in the life of those who have a faith. And what does the modern family look like? And that is a real issue in terms of with the fragmentation of what family means and family units. Okay, to some extent, they're still being held together by tradition and cultural forces. But even in 2 generations, there's been a shift. If the family is to mean anything, it has to mean a place where one grows as a religious being. And I think for a lot of people, once they leave the family home, and this is across religious traditions, the lure of that faith diminishes. I tweeted this because it was so odd and slightly funny, but when I was coming through the border control, the guy, for the first time ever, didn't take my fingerprint, didn't ask me anything, but I automatically said, yes, I'm a lecturer in religion. And he said to me, I lost my faith last year. And I thought, this is a strange conversation to be having, but I just want to get to the other side. But because he seemed so sincere, and I said, why did you lose it? He said, because once your parents die, what's holding you together? And I think on a purely personal level, and families that I've seen. Because it's one thing to do an abstract about, yeah, this is the Islamic view, but I'm talking more about what I'm seeing. People find it much harder once they leave their initial family home to then create a new religious environment, unless they are really rooted in that tradition. And I don't think it's about secularity. I think it's just, what does faith mean to you in your life today is not a question that most people know how to answer.
Thank you very much.
Lynn Hunt, James.
Mona, lovely to see you, and thank you for, as usual, your incisive and wide-ranging analysis. The thing that really struck me in a new way in listening to you was the degree to which many of the conflicts you were describing could be described as a contestation over who counts as the really vulnerable minority. That there's been something like a transformation in liberal discourse from a sense of relatively equal competing claims to the public good, where there's a kind of contestation amongst those who are already counted as, in some way, citizens, participants, included within the political project, to a sort of contestation. I mean, at various points in the situations you were describing, there were Muslims who were sort of self-constituting as the threatened minority, Christians self-constituting that way, gay people self-constituting that way, defenders of traditional values, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder, I'd just love to hear you think more about what sort of transformation has enabled that to become, at least apparently, so effective a strategy for contestation in the public square.
On one hand, I think everybody likes to see themselves as a victim now. That's part of the problem. I am still pro the nation state, if I can put it like that, because I've grown up in a nation state, and despite having all these arguments about what the transformation of a religious life and that it transcends boundaries and all the rest of it, whether it's ummah, whether it's, the church in its wider sense, or a Christian community or a Muslim community, I think that the state has an enormously difficult task of how does it keep not making everybody feel equally victimized, but how do you make people feel they have some sense of empowerment? I don't think most people who live in liberal democracies are that engaged with public life. They just want to be left alone to do their own thing. The only reason I think you hear now people is because people are feeling that something is being taken away from them. Not necessarily leading to disempowerment, but in the sense that, so for example, when it comes to, in one way you could say, politically, the working classes, the only thing they've ever had is a vote. They're not in positions of power. They're not in, there's a huge drive to how you get working class white men to be part of the political process. Not to be on the margins and be part of extremist groups, but why are they the least empowered out of all the groups in the UK? It sounds slightly bizarre as to why would they be, but on the other hand, this becomes an easy trope to then fight your battles on. That the elite, whoever these elites are, and this elite could be anyone who is not working class, have disempowered you even more. So they're white, they're male, most of them are ordinary citizens. Suddenly when they start feeling disempowered and you go down the hierarchy, there are so many other groups that are not even there, but who never thought of themselves being disempowered until they started making them feel, you have more privilege than I have. And I think what we're finding at the moment is the state has taken a back seat. It's just letting everybody fight over one another, as long as there's no civil disobedience. The Muslims, I would say, the Christian voice is often quite muffled, because most people will say, you've got the established church, you've got bishops in the House of Lords, what are you complaining about? And it's a default position to be critical of the Christians, because they can take it. Europe is Christian, that's the backbone of Europe, and the secular lobby is more against the Christian West than it is about the minority religions, which is odd. But when it comes to Muslim minorities, it's not so much that there is a vitriol against them, it's more that this is not how we want Europe to be. So when Pope Benedict, I can't remember which year, made the speech about Europe's future must be Christian, The backlash against that was that no, Europe's future is going to be secular. So that, because there was no threat from minority groups, they would never have power. It doesn't matter how much they might protest around a school or whatever, they're not going to have the power. But what we don't want is a Christian resurgence, which I find quite baffling. But I think in some ways there is a battle about who is the biggest victim out of all this. And largely, even when it comes to minority faith groups, it's usually Muslims and the majority Christians. None of the other faiths seem to matter. It's as if they have no voice, even though they have. But, they're never in the public. And the state seems fine with that. I don't know whether that answered your question, but there's a sense that, we'll just stand back and watch this play out.
We could take one more question if somebody's got a burning question you'd like to pose. Thanks, James.
Thank you. This is a very small question. First of all, thank you for being here and for your work.
Thank you.
As I'm sure you know better than we, the number and the practice of religion in Europe is sinking faster and further than in the United States. With the influx of people who I assume are still practicing their Muslim religion, do you think that's going to have any effect on the balance? For one thing, I understand that many Muslim families have a higher birth rate than others. Is that changing attitudes or desire to practice religion among other groups in Europe? Are they aware of it or having
I think they are aware of it. And I think there are certain voices, and I won't name any, who are very keen to point this out, that if Europe continues to be on this particular issue of birth rate, then where will Christianity end up? Where will Christianity find its place? I think it's a little bit alarmist, because I think that Europe is still hugely Christian in so many ways. The UK, despite many people saying this is a secular country, is still hugely Christian in the way we mark our calendar, in the way that the whole rhythm of life works around the Christian calendar. And the odd thing is that it's not the minority faiths that have a problem with that. It's not even the minority faiths that point out, well, if there's a low birth rate, what will that do to the balance? I think the real issue is that most people who are not practicing are simply not concerned about what will Europe's future be. Because for them, the default position is a secular liberal democracy, and they think that that's just a given. They don't realize how hard it is to keep. If you think this is a good thing, how hard it is to keep that status quo, how hard it is to fight for that. There is some concern, but I don't think it's ever made that public. I mean, it may be in churches, it may be behind the scenes, but in normal political discourse, it's never raised.